And so, good morning again. If you don't know me, and if you do know me, I'm Reverend Elisha Christopher. I'm the spiritual director here at Center for Spiritual Living Santa Cruz. My personal chosen pronouns are they and them, and my ancestors come from all over Europe, the more I study my family history. But I know that my father's ancestors immigrated to this country from Scotland and Ireland, and my mother's ancestors immigrated to this country from Holland and Austria. So, let's begin with a few breaths. Take a deep breath in and let go. Another deep breath in and let it go. One more full deep breath in and let it go. And so here we are. It is the first day of spring. I am a spring creature. I was born in April. My birthday's just around the corner. Hooray! Another rotation around the sun. And, for me, spring is like the season when I feel the most alive. And winter is the season where I just want to crawl up and wait for spring to come back. So I breathe easy knowing that we're now stepping into spring. And I say that because I want to remind you that our theme for the month in our year's exploration of our journey we're calling our year of inner and outer permaculture. As we're studying the 12 principles of regenerative agriculture, this month our theme is to design from patterns to details. To pay attention to the big patterns, to the overarching themes and movements that are happening in your life or your environment. And then based on the awareness of those greater patterns, you can then design your yard or your life or your home or your choices or your destiny if you're aware of the greater patterns in which you're living in. And this whole theme of inner and outer permaculture is really about inviting all of us to look to nature, to look to the nature of the universe and to ask ourselves, what does it look like to replicate the patterns that naturally lead to thriving, right? Because in the modern Western world in which we all live, we are surrounded by all sorts of patterns that do not lead to thriving. Right? We live in a world that works for some at the expense of most, right? That overarching pattern is the thing we are trying to unravel, right? We say here at the center that we have a vision of a world that works for everyone. And if you've heard our global vision statement, we've described deeply what that means to us. That, to me, is the vision. It's the pattern that I am looking to invite into my life and in the world, and that we are seeking to call into our community. And then from that greater vision, we then measure all of the things that we do and say and be in this place. Does it match this greater pattern? And I am someone who has been led by a deep longing, calling, pull, call it a vision, much of my life that has led me to this path called ministry that eventually led me to this place, right? And I believe, and my teacher Gene Houston teaches, that each one of us has a greater self, has a destiny, has a purpose in this world that is always pulling on us and always calling us. And the more we listen to that call, the greater joy, harmony, thriving, resilience, and power we might experience in our life. And the more we allow the world, perhaps, or those around us to implant their version of what that's supposed to look like, the less harmony and joy we experience, right? Oftentimes, each one of us, whether you know it or not, has something deep inside of you that's calling you. And then we question ourselves. We doubt ourselves. We let other people's patterns and perceptions of what we should be overlay onto our patterns and perceptions of who we know we should be. And this idea of designing from patterns to details is just so incredibly science of mind to me. It comes from this permaculture philosophy, looking at nature and landscapes. But really, if you think about it, our thoughts are patterns. We all live in patterns of thinking, right? We know how the brain works. Little electrical synapses and connections and electrical currents and all this stuff is running over the surface of our brain. And I want you to imagine for a moment that the way that you think is a pattern through which electricity moves over the surface of your brain, right? And that those patterns are created by about the time we're 4 years old. Most of those patterns are sort of locked into place. And then through the rest of our life, our education, our choices, all that we do, we can manipulate and change those patterns a little bit and more and more and more the more we're willing to try. But how many of you have had some kind of negative experience in childhood? Maybe your art teacher told you you can't draw, or maybe your parent said something to you, or maybe you were told to shut up too many times, or whatever it is. And then you notice that as you walk through your life, that same pattern of experience keeps repeating itself over and over and over again. Anyone ever had that experience? You're like walking through your life and you're like, how in the world is this happening again? Right? And it's because we know that the universe is creating through consciousness, through our individual consciousness and through our collective consciousness. And so our individual consciousness is made up of all of these patterns that we might call beliefs. And those beliefs manifest as our expectation. And our expectation then manifests as what we see and perceive. And then what we see and perceive reinforces that belief pattern so that we expect it again, right? And so some of you have heard me talk about this before, but how many of you know what your default mode network is? Oh, 3 of you. Okay, so you have a default mode network, which is the term for a series of interconnected brain functions that are going on inside of your head that involves your frontal lobe and your hippocampus and a bunch of different pieces of your brain that basically is the programmed reality that you expect, right? And it's the default mode that your brain operates in. And the more we live in a regular pattern, say a 9-to-5 job or the expected routine that you live in, the more you live in a repetitive pattern of sameness, the more the default mode network wants to lock in. The more the default mode network locks in, the more anxious we feel, the more depressed we can feel, and the harder it is to see choices, right? And many of you know I have a lifelong history with depression and anxiety. And one of the interesting things that I have found over the years, especially in new neuroscience, is that the new neuroscience is saying that depression is a symptom of a lack of making new neuronal connections. Well, so did you hear that? So depression emerges when the brain gets stagnant. And the way to keep the brain from stagnating is inviting in new patterns or breaking the default mode network. What's interesting is that things like sitting still, taking long, slow, deep breaths, and being there for a period of time turns the volume down on the default mode network and makes it so that the patterns that are there start to soften, and it allows something else in, right? And it's meditation, chanting, all forms of spiritual practice, including things like extreme sports and psychedelics, open up this default mode network. It shakes up the pattern, right? A friend of mine says you have to, every once in a while, you have to shake the Etch-a-Sketch. You have, you're building these patterns of experience and you're twisting your little knobs of life with all your twisting and turning of choices, and eventually the pattern just gets really messy. And at some point you gotta shake it up so you can start over again, to actually see clearly what you're working with. Because if the pattern is all distorted everywhere, it's really hard to see where your choices are, right? And we talk about being a community dedicated to possibility. And I really believe that possibility thinking is the thing that's going to get us out of this great big global mess that we are in, that humanity has brought us to, that we get to be the ones to unravel, right? The environment and society and the whole world seems to be falling apart. And it's because we've tied up all these great big knots and we've built all of these patterns that don't actually serve us. And that we have to figure out a way to create the new patterns and systems that invite all of us to live in harmony with each other and with the world, right? And that we have to be the ones to open our minds to think about, to be able to receive these possibilities. But if we're not dedicated to some form of deep spiritual practice, we are committing ourselves to a closed perception. We have to find ways to break out of our everyday, ordinary thinking. We have to be willing to touch into a deeper pattern that's going to allow us to recognize and remember that there's more happening here than we can see. You know, the message that, you know, anyone, I always say this, anyone who's ever met God always comes back and says one thing: God is love. Anyone else who says they met God and tells you anything else other than that is lying to you. Just saying. Anytime anyone comes up to you and says, God told me to tell you, don't trust him. So this is what God told me to tell you. Just kidding. Just kidding. So, you know, I really want to invite us to really recognize that the world that we are living in is reflecting back to us the patterns of our thinking all the time. All the time. But you don't exist in a vacuum either, right? What's being reflected back is the sum total of our collective thinking. And that has actually a whole lot more power on every single one of us than any one of our individual thoughts. If we remember that we are part of a collective of consciousness and that what we are participating is a field of overlap, what we are participating in is a field of overlapping patterns of thinking, we can recognize that it's in the overlap. When we come together in conversation or in prayer to be with each other in consciousness, that's when the something more emerges that can help break us out of our rigid thought patterns, right? To open up, to recognize that there's something more to life than what we think is right in front of us. But we have to be open and willing to perceive something different. We have to be willing to seek it out. You know, and for those of you, many of you participated in some of you participated in the spiritual mind treatment mini retreat workshop we had yesterday, which was incredibly powerful. And it was a beautiful opportunity for some of us to sit and be in that overlap of consciousness and to walk ourselves through the process we here in this center teach called spiritual mind treatment, which is our 5-step affirmative prayer, which is a pattern of thinking, right? And that when you regularly walk your mind through a pattern of thinking that says, remember that there's only one thing in the universe, we call it God or love or life or evolution, remember that you are part of it. Just those first 2 steps is enough, right? I said to the group yesterday, anything you ever need to pray about, anything that's ever seems to be distorted in your field is because you or someone around you has forgotten one of 2 things. That God is all there is, or that you are one with God, right? Somehow we've lost track of one of those 2 things. We lose track of our divinity, and then everything looks messy. If we remember that there is a deep, innate presence or pattern or beingness that is involved in absolutely everything, and we're willing to look back to that in every moment, when all of the really naughty, interesting, strange patterns show up that we don't like at all, we can measure that and say, wait a minute, maybe there's something else here, right? We can look at the little details, or we can look to the bigger patterns. And in my synthesis work, I invite my students to work a lot with mythology and archetypes, to look to some of the bigger collective shared patterns that humanity has created, called stories and archetypal figures that we can look to recognize that there are bigger powers that surround us. There are larger bubbles of consciousness that we are participating in. And the story in which you live means everything. Right? We've all heard context is everything. I think someone like Einstein or something told us that. You know? But really, the context is your mythos, your story, your worldview. Right? I talked a couple weeks ago about the just the difference in origin stories. If you look at the Genesis story from the Bible, or you look at in the book Braiding Sweetgrass that some of us are reading in the beginning of that book, the author references the story of Sky Woman, which is the creation story of a particular indigenous tribe in the Northwest. And those two stories could not be more different from each other. Right? In one, the world was created for its inhabitant. Its inhabitant was a man, and he was given dominion over all of it. Well, that story then fractals out, right, into whole worldviews and ways of perceiving. But the story of Sky Woman was about an immigrant who came to this world, and she was a woman, and what she came to do here was to learn how to live in harmony with those who were already here. Well, that story fractals out into a whole worldview that says the world is sacred and that we are here to learn from the family of life. Those are two very different mythologies, right? And those different mythos are the base patterns of thinking through which the inhabitants of those stories look at the world, right? And those stories mean absolutely everything, even if we think they're fictional, even if we think mythology is not true. Sometimes it's truer than true because it informs us about what we're willing to believe is true and how we're willing to see the world. And so the question I would ask you is, what is your origin story? What is your mythos about the universe in which you live and your place in it? You know, I said to the group at the workshop yesterday that I have two sort of base principles that I believe about the universe that I state over and over and over again to myself in almost every prayer I do. And one is that I am the universe in miniature. It's a quote from Gene Houston. You are the universe in miniature. That all of the magnitude and glory and power and patterns and possibility that exist in the universe exist in you. That there is more space within you than there is matter. You are as vast as the universe itself, just smaller. Right? And the second piece that I remind myself is that I am being breathed by God. That I am being breathed by God. You know, I often say in my prayers, recognize that you are being breathed by something greater than yourself. That there is something that is beating your heart, something that is breathing your body, and you aren't the one doing it. If I can recognize that that's my base pattern, that's my base story about who I am in the universe, that I am evolution happening right now, right in front of you, you are evolution taking place, that's an invitation for us to then live differently with the world than if we're here to conquer or use it. You know, I've heard it said that throughout culture, if we look back at history and across the world, societies, and some of you have heard me say this before, societies almost always view their relationship to women and the earth in the same way. Right? We call her Mother Earth, right? But if societies that view the earth as sacred often hold women in a higher place in society. And societies that view the earth as something to be used, it translates over the other way. And we've seen that history in our world, right? We felt it. And so we're continuously watching that thing play out. And what I think is in front of this current living generation on planet Earth is to be the ones who rewrite the stories in which we live. That if you are alive right now, you are here to be part of the great turning, the great transition. And some of you know that I have a personal mythology that I believe that the paradigm shift, the second coming, whatever you want to call it, the age of Aquarius, the Great Awakening, whatever you want to call it, 2020 was year zero. We're 2 years in. And some of you remember that on the first Sunday in January in 2020, I said to this room, what if this was year zero and this was the beginning of a new era? And then somewhere across the globe, someone flicked the dominoes and everything changed. And here we are in a brand new world, right? And everything is up for rearrange. Everything is up to be rewritten, right? One of the things that I felt so blessed by was to come in as the spiritual leader of this community right as we were coming out of the tail end of a global pandemic, which meant that we had 2 years where all of our patterns and expectations of what we did in this place got broken. And no one expected it to be the same when they walked back in the door. So we've had this beautiful blessing over the last year and a half or 2 years where all of our expectations about what normal looks like have been thrown out the window. And it's all up for recreation. And I really believe that so much of the turmoil and the discord and the upheaval and the separation and all the pain that we're witnessing in the world is because people's mythologies, people's worldviews, for the most part, no longer match the world in which they live. And that cognitive dissonance will break a mind, right? And so instead of living in 2,000, 3,000, 4,000-year-old stories about what we're doing here, and then using that information to navigate the world, we need to look at the world and see what is emerging, and then create new stories that inspire us about what we are doing here, right? And we each have to have a personal mythology, and then we need a bigger story about what's happening in the world, right? If I'm willing to view the global scene as the beginning of a new era and the breakdown of an old one, everything that comes up is part of that story. And in some ways, it's disturbingly beautiful. Right? Because all the stuff that was not working is literally crumbling in front of our eyes and coming up for all of us to look at. But now that we can see it, we can start cleaning up the mess and composting it. You know? And using everything that is in front of us right now to help propel us forward. Because we can either get swallowed up as it all crumbles and falls down, or we can be the ones who are here moving and directing the energy, calling in the new vision, choosing the new possibilities, choosing the new solutions, saying yes to what is possible, and actually building a world that works for ourselves, for everyone, and for life. Some of you have heard me say this before. I believe 100% that every solution to every problem facing humanity right now has already been thought of, is available, and someone on earth is doing it somewhere. All we have to do is start using the solutions. They're all here. But we have to bring that into our own lives. We have to start making those little itty-bitty changes at the level of choice and at the level of story. If we can believe a bigger possibility, if we can reach into a bigger story and create a pattern of possibility that is so compelling that we can't not move towards it, that's how we're going to do this, right? We know that fear hijacks our brain causes that default mode network to lock in and only see what's in front of us. But possibility opens our mind and allows us to look for new connections, which is the activity of building new patterns in mind. And those new patterns in mind are what we need to build a new experience in the details in front of us. So that's what we're doing. Together, all year, forever and ever. Amen. Take a deep breath. And let it go. Take another deep breath in. And let go. Another deep breath. I'm going to ask my practitioners and ministers to stand and hold the space in this room with me. As we breathe again, let us each pause and remember that we are being breathed by something greater than ourselves. That it is the life of the universe. It is the force of evolution. It is the one mind, the one heart, and the one life that has been unfolding, interacting, evolving for all of time, across all space. We are being breathed, each one of us. And so feel your breath. And notice that pattern, that ebb and flow, that rise and fall of spirit in and as you moving through your body as your very breath. And as we feel the Spirit breathing this room, let us remember that there is indeed one seamless presence that is living and breathing throughout the entirety of the universe, unfolding, evolving in everyone and everything. And as we acknowledge that that is true across all of space and time, we then bring that awareness right back into this place and remember that that is the truth of who each one of us is. That we are life, that we are evolution, that indeed we are the universe in miniature. We are divine. And let us remember that it is through the power of divine mind, as it is inhabiting our brains and our perception, that we then be the place where the universe chooses what will happen next. We are the place where now evolution has gone from being an activity of chance to becoming an activity of choice. We are evolution in action. Let us choose to be so in everything we do every day. Because the solutions are in front of us. Our job is to choose the highest possibility and to again choose the highest possibility and to again choose the highest possibility and continue to move towards it until we receive it, until we be it, until we inhabit it so deeply that it simply is. And so with another breath, let us be in gratitude for remembering that we are the universe alive, that there is a power for good in this universe that is greater than we are, and if we so choose, it can and will use each one of us to bring about a greater good for all and for ourselves individually. And so let us just open our hearts and minds to receive those possibilities, to break out of our default mode network, patterned thinking, and be willing to receive something new, to see and be in a new way. And so let us just surrender. As easily as we allow the Great Spirit to breathe us, let it live through us in everything we do. And take another breath as we just let it be. And so it is. Thank you, my friend.